Hola a todos, muy buenos días.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here with us. Several vaccines against COVID-19 have already received approval for emergency use by the WHO, opening the path for deployment by the Kovacs mechanism in the whole region and the world. But what is Kovacs? How does it work? And what vaccines will be available? And also, when do we hope or expect that these vaccines will reach the countries of our region? And will there be equitable access of these vaccines against COVID-19? My name is Sebastián Oriel from PAHO, and today we are going to talk about this and much more. We have Dr. Jarbas Barbosa, Subdirector of PAHO. Hello, Doctor. Good morning. Hello, Sebastian. Good morning. Thank you, Doctor, for being here with us to talk about COVAX and the vaccines against COVID-19 and this space that we have created in PAHO to talk about knowledge based in science. And we want to share this with all of you that follow us in social media. But also with the doctor, we will receive questions that you may have about vaccines and COVAX. So in the social media that you are following us in, both in Twitter, Facebook, in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, we'll be answering all these questions. So, Doctor, to begin to talk about this topic and maybe to shed light on a little bit more on COVAX, can you talk a little bit more about what COVAX is? Yes, that's important because actually COVAX is a mechanism, it's a new mechanism that we never had before in the world. COVAX was created last year. Last year, the WHO, World Health Organization, with other partners, created 3 pillars to accelerate access to the tools that are necessary to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are 3 pillars. One for medication. This pillar was very important to coordinate clinical tests in the whole world to verify the efficacy of these medications. We haven't seen any medications that have been approved yet to prevent or to reduce the intensity of transmission or to prevent or avoid that people come to a serious form of the disease. But this pillar was very important for the poor countries in Africa and Asia, that they would receive dexamethasone, which is a corticoid drug that can reduce up to 30% the mortality in cases of COVID-19 that need therapy with oxygen. So this pillar was very important. Another pillar is the tests and diagnostics pillar. This pillar was responsible for the dissemination of a test that is an antigen test that costs 25% only of the cost of a PCR test. It has a very similar performance and it does not need a lab. So it can be used for populations in rural areas where it's difficult to go to. And so this test was a part of that development in that pillar. And then we have the vaccine pillar. So we have 3 sub-pillars in this pillar. One of them that is led by CEPI, C-E-P-I, which is the Coalition for the Development of Tools for Emerging Diseases. So this pillar tries to support research and production of new vaccines. So there are many projects, including in Latin America. We have projects from PAHO that we have institutions that are developing vaccines in Cuba and Brazil and other countries in contact with CEPI, CEPI, so they can get support, financial support for the clinical essays phase 1, 2, and 3. We have another pillar, which is the World Health Organization, the leadership pillar, which is for allocation of vaccines. And there's a third pillar, which is the acquisition and the delivery or deployment of these vaccines, which is called COVAX. COVAX is led by Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Immunization. So the great goal of COVAX is to ensure that the countries can receive vaccines in an equitable manner. There are two ways to participate in COVAX. We have more than 190 countries that already participate in COVAX. We have 92 countries that will receive the vaccines without paying. These are countries that have low-income countries. They're poor countries that will receive these vaccines without having to pay for them. In the Americas, we have 10. And the other countries are countries that have their own funding. So they will pay for them and they will receive the vaccines. So this is basically how the mechanism works, the COVAX mechanism works. It's a new mechanism. When it was created, we had to look for financial support and donations, and this took some time. And we also had to convince the countries on how to participate in this new mechanism, to support the countries and to answer all their questions. So it's a mechanism that I think is very useful. However, it will be much more useful if a mechanism like COVAX can become a permanent mechanism with the necessary funds, with everything already in place, so we can, in a future pandemic, have a capacity, a greater capacity, and a more significant capacity to ensure equitable access. Thank you, Doctor. And about equitable access, we see in the media and at the end of December, we saw that some countries started to vaccinate with the first vaccine that was available. And now we know that there are other vaccines also available. And we have a bit of anxiety, and people want to receive these vaccines in an equitable manner. How is PAHO working for that purpose? Well, the revolving fund, the PAHO's revolving fund, jointly with UNICEF, these are the two mechanisms that are carrying out the acquisitions in behalf of COVAX. So the revolving fund has more than 40 years of experience in vaccine acquisition in all the countries. UNICEF also has a lot of experience with these countries that receive vaccines through Gavi donations for about 20 years. So that's how we are working. So firstly, it's important to identify that since the world did not have a decision about an equitable access mechanism, this took a few months till it was possible to begin these negotiations. So the market rules are rules that do not favor equitable access. So the countries started, since last year, they started to establish agreements that the countries that could pay for it, and some countries actually bought enough vaccines for 4 or 5 times their population. So that really made it difficult for the COVAX mechanism to acquire these vaccines, and also we had to have some time to receive the donations from the rich countries to start negotiations. But all of that is now coming to a time that we all hope for, which is to start to definitely deploy. And next week, the countries in the whole world will receive detailed information about how much and when they will receive from COVAX. So it's our expectation that this will happen between the end of February and the beginning of March. The countries will receive all the information about all the months of the first semester. So the COVAX mechanisms was able to ensure 2 billion doses of vaccines for 2021, and 1 billion is already insured for the first semester of 2022, but this is not enough. So that the vaccine can have the possibility of controlling the transmission jointly with the other measures, the vaccine in an isolated manner will not have that capacity. So we will need to maintain our prevention methods or prevention measures. But we will try to, we want to vaccinate at least 70% of the population in the whole world. So we need to do more. We have the announcement from the United States administration that the U.S. is going to participate as a donor for COVAX. So that is a very important information, because this will allow us to think about COVAX not only for the 20% of the population, which is already guaranteed, but to go beyond. And we want to think also about the poorer countries in the world and the possibility of that, so that the vaccine can contribute to control the transmission. Very well, doctor. One of the things that you mentioned is that we still don't have an exact date about when we will receive the vaccines in any country. We have Israel Palacios that is asking, when do we think that the vaccines will reach our country? But we still don't know the exact date, right? Yeah, well, on the 23rd, the COVAX mechanism will send a letter to all the countries. And why does it take time? Because we're talking about a logistic for 190 countries. So it's a period, we're living in a period that we have a lot of canceled flights because of the pandemic. So, and the supply of flights is much lower. We have also all the regulatory issues and the assessments that we have to carry out. But our expectation is that at the end of February and the first month of March, the vaccines, the COVAX vaccines, will start to arrive in our countries. The amounts that will arrive initially are limited amounts. And this is a reality in the whole world, with one or two exceptions of countries. But even in Europe, presently, with the exception of the UK, all the other countries are only vaccinating about 4 or 5% of their population. So during the first semester, the access to vaccines will be limited. That is why it's important that the countries will have a vaccination plan that is very well established with the priority groups that will be vaccinated. The WHO recommendation, PAHO's recommendation, is to use this vaccine that will arrive to save lives. So who needs to be vaccinated first? So the health professionals that are in direct contact with patients in hospitals and clinics, because they are more vulnerable to be able to contract COVID-19. Other professionals from other social areas that also have direct contact with the population and are essential. For example, people that work in the hospices for the elderly, because they are people that can be vectors for these elderly people. So every country needs to plan this very well. So then we have the vaccination for the elderly and also for adults that have chronic diseases like diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, other immunological deficiencies, because they are at risk to develop a serious form of COVID-19 and therefore die of COVID-19. So that is our first goal. So this will be important because it will reduce mortality, it will save lives, but this will not yet interrupt transmission. That is why the use of masks and keep social distancing and to avoid crowds and to avoid going out unless it's for an essential activity, to avoid being in closed spaces. So we have to keep all these measures. This will be key to ensure that transmission in the Americas will not continue in some countries, and it won't continue to grow as it is in some countries at the moment. Thank you, Doctor. So you said 2 billion vaccines that will reach the countries in all the world, 190 countries that participate in COVAX, and this is to immunize 20% of the population, and this it will happen in 2021, and then they will. We won't get 20% to all countries at the same time. So we're not going to expect that in March we get 20% of the vaccines, right? We will receive them by batches, right? Yes. So vaccines will arrive every month, but I think advantage that the countries have is foreseeability. So we have some countries that started to vaccinate with bilateral agreements. They're not COVAX, vaccines, and some are suspending vaccination because they don't have any more doses. They're looking for more doses. Others are reducing the application. So there's a lot of discussion about how to use well these vaccines. So it's important. Besides having the vaccine, we have to be this foreseeability. So this letter that all the countries will receive, there is the right amount that they will get at each date, because then every country can determine what they want to do. In March, we're going to vaccinate this group, and in April, this other group, and in May, another group. That we have to, and this is very important, so that the countries can, in a transparent manner, clarify to the population what are the priority groups and what is the criteria that they're using to vaccinate. All right, doctor. I was reading a little bit about that to protect our health workers, we would need about 3% of our vaccines. So 3% of the population, is that the right number? Yes, that is an estimate that we have, and that 3%, which is our first goal in Kovacs, is to reach these 3%. So this would be enough to vaccinate all our health workers that are working in our countries. And then we have other professionals from social essential areas that also have contact with people. So this is our first goal. The second goal is it's another 17% of the population. And so with that 3%, it would add up to 20%. So 17% are enough to vaccinate all the elderly adults and all the adults that have any chronic diseases that may be a risk for the serious form of the disease. So that's why we say that the first goal that we have with this vaccine is to save lives. It's not going to interrupt transmission, and we can't be under the illusion that if we start vaccinating today, in a week or in a month, the transmission will be interrupted. That's not true. All right, doctor, we wanted to talk a little bit about the vaccines that we will get through COVAX. We saw that Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines and AstraZeneca Oxford vaccines have received approval from WHO for emergency use. Why are these vaccines going to reach COVAX and other vaccines won't yet? Well, COVAX is a mechanism that when we launched it last year, when we started working PAHO with UNICEF. So we have this revolving fund. So, and we had this bidding process, and we invited all the producers that want to participate. And COVAX already has a contact and negotiation with at least 16 vaccine producers, and all the producers are welcome to COVAX. However, in COVAX, we need to have some criteria. One of them is that all the vaccines that can be acquired for the COVAX mechanism, they need to be pre-qualified vaccines, or they need to have an use authorization for emergency from WHO. So that is a process that will ensure the quality, the safety, and the efficacy of the vaccine. It's the same criteria that our revolving fund always uses for all the vaccines that we buy for our countries. And then in more than 40 years, we never had any problems. So we are maintaining that same procedure. So many producers have shown interest in participating. The Pfizer vaccine is already available since the end of December. It already has the emergency use authorization. The AstraZeneca vaccines, they got authorization on Monday, 3 days ago. So I say there are three, because AstraZeneca has their own vaccine produced in Europe, but AstraZeneca decentralized their technology to other two producers. One of them is in India, the Serum Institute of India, that is already producing the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine as well, and also a producer in South Korea, which is the KS Biosite producer that is also producing vaccines. So this was a bit of a more complex process, because they need to prove that The production in India and in South Korea are exactly in the same quality conditions and safety and efficacy of the original vaccine. So we have these. We also have the Moderna vaccine that is in the final phase of analysis. We have the Novavax vaccine that also will be produced by the Novavax plant, and also the plant of the same producer in India, the Serum Institute from India, will produce two vaccines, the Novavax and the AstraZeneca vaccine. So this is also under assessment, and we should get this in a few days or weeks. There are two producers from China, Sinopharm and Sinovac, that have requested also the authorization. Since these two don't have pre-qualified vaccines, the process is a little bit longer. So the WHO sent an inspection team to the factories in China. This inspection was done, and now they are reviewing the dossier. So we hope that in March we should conclude that process, and we will decide if they will get the authorization or not in these producers from China. So we continue to negotiate with all the producers. Any producers that meet the requirements are welcome to COVAX. So we have this group of vaccines that are approved for use, and then we have others that are undergoing the process. Doctor, so how do you, in the first deployments that COVAX does for the countries, since now we have in our basket, we have the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine. How do we decide which countries get what vaccine? Could they get both or one or the other? Well, the countries, the self-funding countries and the countries that receive vaccines without paying, when they adhere to the COVAX mechanisms, they inform some characteristics. For example, some countries, since the beginning, they told us that we don't have, we're not interested in Pfizer's vaccine because Pfizer's vaccine needs a ultra refrigeration process, and we minus 70, and we don't have these conditions in some of our countries. Other countries established that they would not accept vaccines that were above a certain price, these self-funding countries, because the range of prices is quite broad. We have some vaccines that cost $4, $3 to $4 per dose. Then we have vaccines that cost $30. So some countries said, well, I will not accept any vaccines that will cost more than $15. So with all of that, if we have an algorithm for the country. So the countries need to be ready to receive the vaccine. We can't receive vaccines if you don't have the capacity to use them. So the 10 countries that will receive the vaccine without having to pay for them, they had to prepare their national plans for distribution and vaccination distribution. PAHO supported these 10 countries. All these 10 countries of the region, they have already sent the date, the final date, last week. So they all sent this. It was reviewed by PAHO, and they're all ready to receive the vaccine. The countries that are paying for the vaccines, they are sharing their national plans, and they are confirming their capacity to receive the vaccine and to keep it stored in a safe manner and to be able to distribute them. So this is very important because the vaccine has to start to be used right away and in a safe manner. Perfect, doctor. And for those that are connecting right now, I want to let you know that we're live here talking to Dr. Jadvas Barbosa, Director of PAHO. We're talking about the COVAX mechanism and the vaccines against COVID-19. You can ask us questions in our social media. I'm going to read some of the questions that we've received so far. For example, Gaston Sarapura says that the Sputnik vaccine, is it effective against the new South African strain? Thank you for that question. Firstly, there is a global concern with the new variants because the new variants can affect the protection capacity of the vaccines. So we need to evaluate every vaccine because sometimes people talk about vaccines against COVID as if only the brand is different, but that's not true. The technological platform they use is totally different. So we have some vaccines that are already being used that are vaccines that use technological platforms that are quite well known, that are used for other vaccines like measles and influenza and other diseases. And we have also technological platforms that are very new, like the messenger RNA. So we have to evaluate every vaccine. So the Sputnik vaccine is the institute that is producer. They informed to WHO that they are interested in getting authorization for this emergency use, but till yesterday, till last night at least, they still did not deliver their dossier so that we can evaluate the quality and the safety and efficacy. So we cannot talk about what is the behavior of that vaccine, the Sputnik vaccine, and especially regarding the new variants. There are some vaccines that we do have some information because, for example, in Africa, South Africa, they were doing clinical tests of phase 1 and 2 with AstraZeneca vaccine, and there is a concern because it looks like it reduces the efficacy, and but the number of people was a very limited amount. So this is still under assessment. The recommendation of the strategic group of WHO is that we should use the AstraZeneca vaccine until we get more information. So we can't not use a vaccine just because of a small amount of people. And the other vaccines that we're testing in the labs, like the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, they informed that for the variants that have been detected, the variant that was identified first in the UK, and the variant that was identified first in South Africa, and the variant that was identified first in Brazil, the vaccines still protect against these variants, but we need to monitor it. And this is an important warning because the issue of equitable access is a moral issue, like the Secretary General of the UN, Secretary Gutierrez, mentioned yesterday, and our director always mentions this in our press conferences, and also the General Director of WHO also brought this point. And this is a problem that is a health issue. Why? Because let's say that a rich country bought vaccines for all its population, for the adult population, because we don't have any vaccines approved for presently for children and teenagers. But let's say they vaccinate their whole population and they think they're protected. If the virus is still circulating in the other countries of the world, a new variants can and will arise, because that's the normal path of a virus to mutate. And it may be that one of these variants will not be protected by the vaccine that that rich country used. So it's not just a matter of generosity from these countries, but it's a matter of having a strategy that is capable of being effective for global control of the pandemic. That's why we say that no one will be safe till we aren't all safe. And we have a few other questions that we received from Andrea Sarmiento. She asked if it's recommendable to vaccinate those that have already contracted the disease. Yeah, well, that's always a question that people have. Why vaccinate the people that already had COVID-19? So it's important first because we don't know how long the immunity lasts that was given by this vaccine, and this can vary from one person to another. People that had a lighter form can have a lower immunity than others that have a more severe case of the disease. The capacity of the immunological system also changes. So it wouldn't be ethical, therefore, to tell people that already had the disease to not vaccinate. We already had, at least in the region, We had yesterday in Brazil, we saw the first case of someone that was reinfected by COVID-19 that died. So people that already had the disease are not protected. And besides that point, some people had a confirmation of a disease through antibody tests alone or tests that could generate false positives. So the recommendation is to vaccinate people that had the disease previously, because this will ensure that they will be effectively protected. And we started, and we starting to vaccinate the most vulnerable. So we shouldn't allow that people that have diabetes or other diseases that they won't get vaccinated just because they already had the disease. This is something that can really expose them, and it could impose a risk that they may have in a second infection. They may have a more severe form and they may die. So from the health point of view and from the scientific information that we have today, we recommend that the vulnerable groups, regardless of whether they had or not the disease, they should be vaccinated. Yes, and Andrea, also you should check with your the authorities of your country and with your doctors for these specific cases. We have another question from Nanda Oliveira. She asks if the person that receives the vaccine can have any adverse effects or reactions. Yes, the vaccines and drugs in general, they can generate adverse reactions. And so the clinical tests, phase 1, 2, and 3, we assess the safety of these vaccines. So all the vaccines, when they are authorized for use, the authorities, the regulating authorities of each country, they carry out an assessment of these information. So, these informations, and the WHO, when they grant this authorization for emergency use, they do a very detailed assessment of all the data from the clinical test. So till today, all the information that we have, and we already have a very significant amount of vaccines that have been used throughout the world, more than 180 million doses. And the vaccines are safe. There are some adverse reactions, very similar to other vaccines, a little bit of local pain. Some people say that in the first day they had a little bit of fever, but the next day they were fine. So there are some cases of allergic reactions or severe allergic reactions, like other injectable drugs can also cause. So there's no specific concern. Like all the other vaccines, people that already had allergic reactions or severe allergic reactions to other drugs and vaccines, they should inform the health worker or professionals so that we can observe that person through a certain period of time after the dose. But that's not a counterindication to take that vaccine. The vaccines are safe. And besides the clinical test, we're not talking about 30 or 40,000 volunteers in a clinical test. We're talking about 180 million people that have already taken these vaccines. So certainly, there are some variations between different vaccines. Some may have more adverse effects than others, but the vaccines that we are using in the whole world, especially the countries that have regulating agencies and a good system for pharmacovigilance, the informations that we're receiving are quite positive. Very well. We have a question here about the allergies. If the vaccines from Pfizer and AstraZeneca are for allergic people, if we can use them. Yes, well, we're talking about allergic people. That's quite a significant percentage of the world population, because there are people that have allergy to dust or to drugs or medication. So this is not a barrier for even the people that are allergic. They can and should take the vaccine if they are in these groups that need to be vaccinated. If what these people have to do is communicate not only for this vaccine. These people, when they go to take any injectable drug or medication or any other vaccine, they need to inform the professionals, the health professionals. They have to say, well, I have allergy to a certain medication or vaccine, and because this will lead to some procedures that the health professional may take at the moment, but this is not a counterindication for the vaccines. Even people with allergies, they need to take the vaccines if they're under priority groups. Thank you very much for this clarification, Doctor. Another question. So, how safe is it to apply two different vaccines? For example, the first dose is from AstraZeneca, and the second dose a Sputnik vaccine dose. Well, with the data that we have today, we cannot recommend this. This is a question that is important to have an answer because this may facilitate some strategies in some countries. But as I said, the technological platforms of these vaccines are very different. So there is we can't safely say that the first dose of a vaccine and a second dose of another vaccine will generate the same efficacy as if you took the second dose of the same vaccine. So one of the pillars of our mechanism, of our acceleration mechanism to the CEPI, this is supporting some research on this topic. But till now, the efficacy studies that the vaccine producers are presenting, those that have two doses, they talk about the efficacy for two doses of the same vaccine. So we cannot recommend right now any combinations of doses of different vaccines. Very well. Dr. Catalina Logo Guerrero asks if there is a percentage of vaccines in Kovacs that will be destined to refugees and immigrants. She asks if they will be donated, or are these parts of vaccine batches that the countries that take care of this population, if they should buy them. And he asked about Colombia. How much vaccines do we have for immigrants from Venezuela? Well, that's an important issue. I think that immigrants need to have access to vaccines for humanitarian reasons, but also because no country will be protected if they don't vaccinate the immigrants of that country. That's why solidarity is very important. It's important for the vaccination strategy to be effective. We are in conversations with Gavi, with Kovacs governance, to have an amount of vaccines that may be sent to countries here in the region, countries like Colombia and other parts of the world, countries that have a high percentage or high number of immigrants that may receive vaccines for these refugees and immigrants that should receive vaccines. So we're in conversations with other international organizations that deal with refugees and immigrants, and also in partnership with Kovacs. So I think that in a few weeks we will have an answer for that question. It's right. I think this is necessary. It was a very important decision from the government of Colombia to consider the immigrants as people that have rights to health. During the pandemic, I think this demonstrates a humanitarian effort from that country. And so we are working with the Colombian government and other international agencies to ensure that they can have an additional amount of vaccines to be able to guarantee vaccination of immigrants as well. Very well, Doctor. The next question is from Maribel Nyango from Venezuela, and she asks if adults or any person that has fever, if they can also receive a vaccine. No, they shouldn't. And this does not apply only for COVID vaccine, for any vaccine. So it's better to inform that to the health professional and to take the vaccine 2 or 3 days after the fever is gone. Why? Because if you already have fever, it may be that you already have a disease. And if you take the vaccine, you're always going to have a question if what you are feeling is because of the disease or because of the vaccine. So we should not vaccinate people that have a fever or any type of illness. We should wait 2 or 3 days and then take the vaccine once the fever is gone. Perfect. We have another question from Andrea Sarmiento. It says, how many doses should be applied in people that already had COVID? Should we follow the same policy? Yes, because of the reasons I mentioned. The most of the vaccines are 2 doses, so there is only one, the Janssen vaccine, that is 1 dose. That will also be a supplier of our Kovacs mechanism. So the Janssen vaccine is going through their process, and they're publishing all the data. But the Janssen vaccine is the only one that has shown a high efficacy with only 1 dose. But all the others are 2-dose vaccines. All right, and Carla asks about the Sinopharm vaccines, if they will be available and approved by WHO. Well, all the producers are welcome. We always have to think that we don't look at the vaccines by the country of origin, but we look at the quality. And we have this as a rule. Our revolving fund, the PAHO revolving fund, and UNICEF follows the same rule. We can only use vaccines that have been pre-approved by WHO or have the authorization from WHO to be used in emergency. So the vaccine producer, the CoronaVac, Sinovac, and the other Chinese producers, Sinopharm, they have requested the authorization from WHO. Some producers have a faster process because they already have pre-approved vaccines. So WHO already knows their production process. They have already given them the good practice, best practices certificate and other requirements. So these 2 producers, since it's the first time that WHO will analyze this request for the authorization of an emergency use, the process is a bit longer. So we had to WHO had to begin by sending a team to China. They already carried out the inspection of their 2 plants, and now they are analyzing the report of the inspection, and then we will analyze the dossier that all these producers need to deliver. People many times think that the authorization process is bureaucratic, that they only have to send a request. Oh, I would like to get an authorization for my vaccine. And someone will just give it a stamp of approval. Oh, okay, you're approved or not. That's not how it works. These dossiers that ensure the quality and the safety and the efficacy of vaccines, they can have 4,000 or 5,000 sheets of paper. So it's we have to assess this carefully because it's a lot of responsibility when you authorize the use of a vaccine. The vaccines, it's not the same thing as medications. So normally the medications are used for a small amount of people at a time. So you can see if something different happens with that drug or medication. You have time to suspend the use when you have just a small amount of people using them. For the vaccines, firstly, we are using them for healthy people, and secondly, we generally start using it in millions of people at a time. So it's a very big responsibility, and even with all the pressure to have a faster access, we cannot in any way be careless. We need to review carefully these dossiers. So this will be done with Sinovac and Sinopharm, and we think that maybe mid-March we will have a decision. They will be welcome to the Kovacs mechanism because there will be more producers. Perfect. And doctor, about the efficacy, because we saw that we see different vaccines, different results. Some have an efficacy rate of more than 90%, other more than 70%, and we have a bit of a debate about what vaccine is better than others, or what vaccine should I receive, or what vaccine am I going to get or not. What should we take into account here? Well, the vaccines have two effects. One of them is individual, so the protection for the person that took the vaccine, and the other thing is the collective protection, which is what we call herd immunity or collective immunity. That is the term that we use more often. So a inadequate vaccination is when we have a percentage of the population that is vaccinated that may be capable of protecting even those that have not been vaccinated. And this varies from disease to disease and vaccine to vaccine. It's different for measles, polio, and influenza, and also COVID. So we think that for COVID, we have to reach 70% of the vaccinated population to start thinking about controlling the transmission. Other models talk about 90%. So we will have to see how this works in real life. I think Israel will be the first country to reach 70%, and then we will see what happens in Israel. But the efficacy of the vaccines, the WHO initially, based on mathematical models, they considered that vaccines that demonstrate an efficacy higher than 50% can be used to protect people and also to reach herd immunity. So all the vaccines with more than 50% of efficacy or effectiveness can be used. We should not compare directly the effectiveness of different vaccines. Why? Because this effectiveness was generated by the technical the tests of phase 3 clinical tests with 40,000 people or 60,000 people, but now we're going to have the real data of effectiveness in the real world. Sometimes in the clinical tests, the methodology is a little different. For example, the result for the effectiveness so normally they took into account 3 results. First, to avoid the infection, then to avoid serious cases, and then third, to avoid death. So to avoid infection, some vaccines used only health workers as volunteers. So health workers are more, generally speaking, they perceive a symptom, even mild symptoms, faster, so they look for the test to see if they have COVID-19 or not. So that's why to think of a vaccine that has 90% is better than a 70% vaccine is not really right. What does it mean to have 70%, for example, or 80%? In the group that took that vaccine, the incidence of COVID was 70% lower than in the group that took placebo. So the group that did not take the vaccine. But as I said, these were results of 10,000, 20,000, or 30,000 people. Now we are going to have the results in real life. And all the vaccines that have been authorized by WHO, they comply with the effectiveness requirements to ensure both the personal protection as well as to reach collective protection if the vaccination is able to reach a level of more than 70% of the population. Great, Doctor, for this clarification. We have several questions. We keep getting more questions in our social media. Thanks to everyone that is participating with us, talking about COVAX and COVID vaccines. We have a question here from Gabriel Bastidas. He asks, how should a vaccination program work for it to be effective? What are the priority groups? That's something you already mentioned. And he asks if it's correct or it would be right to prioritize authorities like mayors and congressmen and military personnel. Thanks for that question. Well, a immunization program has to look at all the dimensions and aspects. It has to establish the regulating processes the importation of the vaccines, review the cold chain. It has to train the health workers. It has to have a good communication with the population to clarify how the vaccines will be used, how the process will work. In the case of a vaccine of a bilateral agreement that is not from Kovacs, we need to clarify to the population how was the data reviewed regarding safety and efficacy. So all these aspects that in PAHO we are supporting the countries to have all this information. So the priority groups, we make recommendations. The final decision is a decision of each country. So the countries have sovereign decision-making power about how they will carry out their vaccination process. So firstly, we have been recommending to use with health workers because they're more exposed. We see that in the data from Latin America and the Caribbean. These are data that make us very sad because many health workers in our region had the disease and they had the severe case of the disease and they died. So we include also the professionals that are in contact with elderly patients and also key areas of the countries that we need to work on. That would be the 3% that I mentioned before. And then we have to save lives. We have to protect those that are more vulnerable to develop these severe forms of the disease and that may die from COVID. So elderly people and also adults with chronic diseases. These should be the priorities. That is the WHO recommendation and PAHO's recommendation as well. Perfect, doctor. We have a lot of questions here about vaccines that have reached the countries that did not go through pre-approval from WHO or were not included in the emergency use list from WHO. So the question is, are they safe? Is it safe to use these vaccines? What can we say about that? Well, we can only talk about what we know. So these vaccines may be excellent vaccines, but since the pre-approval team from WHO, that our technicians from PAHO also participate in that assessment, till we have the dossiers of these producers to review everything and to be able to really determine that they comply with the requirements, we cannot say if they are good or not. I think that in each country where they are being authorized, it's important that the authorities, the regulating authorities of each country, whether it's in Mexico or ANMAT in Argentina, Anvisa in Brazil, and several countries have their own regulating agencies, and they carried out this assessment. So they need to inform to the population what is the criteria that they used. This is very important to ensure transparency in that process. On our side, as I said, all the producers are welcome. They all have to comply with the same criteria, deliver their dossier, and so that the team can review it. And then we will have safe information to be able to determine the efficacy and the quality and the safety of these vaccines. Thank you, doctor. We have other questions about people that are immunosuppressed or they want to know if they can apply to some of these vaccines that are available. For example, Cecilia Malaga asks what vaccine is approved for patients older than 65 that are taking immunosuppressing drugs. Thank you for the question. So both vaccines that we will deliver through Kovacs, the AstraZeneca and vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine are authorized for all the adults after 18, older than 18, even adults that are older than 65. So we had some debates about the efficacy of AstraZeneca vaccine in older adults over 65. But the strategic committee of WHO that does this assessment and that recommends all the vaccines that are used in the world, they released last week a very detailed document with all of the studies, and they have shown that first, The question that people had was if the amount of people that are older than 65 in the clinical study of the phase 3 of AstraZeneca, there was a small amount of people, and that's true. But even with that small amount of people, we did not have any case of hospitalization or death between these older adults that took the AstraZeneca vaccine. So with this data, the strategic group, that in English it's SAGE, they recommend the use of this vaccine in adults older than 65. So both Pfizer and AstraZeneca are appropriate for this group, which are the two vaccines that we have in Kovacs right now. For adults that take immunosuppressors, they can take the vaccines. Generally, those that have the need to take immunosuppressing drugs or that have their immunological system compromised for any reasons, they should not take vaccines such as yellow fever vaccines, for example. But the Kovacs vaccines, they don't use that live attenuated virus technique. So these are vaccines that are safe for these people. More than that, these people have a higher risk of developing a severe case of the disease. So the people that have an affected immunological system, they are part of the vulnerable group that we need to prioritize, also with the people that have high blood pressure, diabetes, and other diseases. Thank you, Doctor. Well, since we are reaching the end of our session, of this conversation that we've had about COVAX and the COVID-19 vaccines, I just wanted to ask you if you wanted to give us a final comment about the vaccines in our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, take into account this moment of the pandemic that we're in, and also the anxiety that some countries are feeling to receive these vaccines as soon as possible. Well, thank you. These questions are quite specific, and when we recommend a vaccine through COVAX, we send to each immunization program a very detailed document. The one that I mentioned from the AstraZeneca vaccine that has 150 pages with the contraindications and recommendations. So the national plans, they adapt and they distribute to all the health workers. So if you are part of a priority group, and if you're wondering about someone in your family, if they can or not take the vaccine, my recommendation is to ask the health worker that is closer to you, because they will be able to answer for each specific case. I think that the COVAX mechanism is a mechanism that will be very important to ensure equitable access. Equitable access is not guaranteed yet. It's important to have more donations from the rich countries, and the meeting of the G7 countries, the United States will probably announce a donation, and other countries as well. And this is very important. And it's also very important that the rich countries that have already bought about 75% of the vaccines of the world, if they could have a bit of an attitude of more solidarity, so that part of these vaccines could be used immediately as well by the COVAX mechanism. This will allow us to start vaccinating now at the end of February, beginning of March, to save lives, but also to think about the second semester to reach a higher coverage with a vaccine that will be able to control the transmission of COVID-19. Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you for being with us in this session. Thank you to all of you for your questions and your participation. We now are going through this moment of pandemics and also infodemics. So always be sure you are looking for information and from reliable sources. And this information will allow you to make better decisions. And when it's your time to receive the vaccine in your countries, take the vaccine to protect yourself and those around you, so we can all be able to end with this pandemic. So thank you very much once more. We continue to connect with you through our social media. Greetings. Bye-bye. Greetings.